To introduce this week's guest, here is Roy Swift of the Social Security Administration.
This week, Social Security in America pays a visit to a man who has become a living legend. In bringing you each week a story of one of the more than 23 million Americans who are receiving Social Security benefits, we hope to provide you with information about your Social Security protection. One of the things that America has given to the world is her own style of music, jazz. And the music has enriched the language. Hot, cool, ragtime, these words have a special meaning when applied to music. But let's visit the birthplace of jazz. Jazz, the music that has set feet to tapping all over the world. Way down yonder in New Orleans.
The universal language that America gave to the world came from here. This is New Orleans. Bourbon Street, flashing, exciting. On this famous street, in the heart of the French Quarter, you can feel the pulse beat of New Orleans. At night, Bourbon Street is a street of sounds, and most of these sounds are musical. Sometimes the beat is hot, and sometimes it's cool, but the kind of music is always the same on Bourbon Street. This is where jazz was born. A shark, a key, and a banana. Are clues to the name of one of the pioneers of jazz, Sharky Banano. He began his musical career over 45 years ago. Since that time, he has played with most of the outstanding jazz musicians in the country. Sharky Banano bought his first horn when he was 14. He played professionally for the first time in 1922 at Pete Herman's Ringside in New Orleans. In recognition of his contribution to the world of music, the New Orleans Jazz Museum displays a few of Sharky's musical mementos. The brown derby is his trademark. The museum, located in the historic French Quarter, houses some 10,000 items pertaining to the history of jazz. One of the popular exhibits at the museum is the panel of museumophones, telephones on which the visitor may dial and hear recordings of blues, spirituals, brass bands, and other jazz artistry. This is a forerunner of the banjo. It was brought to this country from Africa by the slaves, and it played an integral part in the shaping of jazz music. During the heydays of minstrel shows, the banjo's popularity spread throughout the country. Jazz bands started with the banjo as a basic instrument. Then the brass was added, and later, the reeds. In 1910, bands like Jack Lane were responsible for putting jazz on the streets and in other outdoor events. Another group of Lane musicians became the original Dixieland Jazz Band, the first band to record in 1917 a jazz record. The name of the song was Tiger Rag. Many of the early jazz bands could play indoors or outdoors. They played on the move, on wagons, on trains, on riverboats. They played at picnics, in parades, in dance halls. They made up a handy group of musicians with a rhythm all its own. The Imperial Orchestra of 1910, an early jazz dance group, often borrowed their instrumentation from classical orchestras. Besides hot music, they could play mazurkas and schottisches. Later, Jelly Roll Morton and others introduced the piano to jazz. This added a new quality to the sound, but put some limits on the band's ability to play anytime, anywhere.
I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield.
Danny Barker is assistant curator of the New Orleans Jazz Museum. Playing a banjo is just one of his many talents. He was a member of the famed Cab Calloway band for many years. Danny has composed dozens of songs, and more than 50 have been recorded by famous artists.
I ain't gonna steady walk no more.
Born and raised in the French Quarter, Danny, like Sharky Banano, is another product of the New Orleans jazz age. We asked Sharky if he could recall when he first became interested in music.
Well, when I was a youngster, I moved with my sister and her husband, who's called John Corella, at a summer resort called Milenburg. In other words, they call it Millenburg. And that's where all the picnics were, that the jazz bands used to play, like King Oliver played there, Sam Morgan, Bill Gallaty, Frank Christian. Oh, a number of bands played, and I became interested in music because I was surrounded by it.
Milenburg, the summer resort where Sharky lived as a youngster, was immortalized in song and later became a jazz classic called Milenburg Joys. Joseph Sharky Banano has been known by his nickname since he was 6 months old.
Because when I was born, I was, well, a sort of lively child. And my brother-in-law was going to be my godfather, and he was a sort of a gambler. So he figured he had a bet on Tom Sharky, so he figured if Tom Sharky would win the fight, I would get the name of Sharky. And that's been my name ever since.
Many legendary jazz figures are best known by their nickname: Satchmo, Jelly Roll, Muggsy, Yardbird, Wingy, and Slow Drag. Alcide Slow Drag Pavageau, who is now almost 80, made this bass fiddle when he was 16. He played it in the famous Bunk Johnson Band during the early 1900s. Like many of the old-time jazzmen, Slow Drag Pavageau is now receiving Social Security benefits and Medicare protection. One of the best-known jazz figures in the world is Louis Satchmo Armstrong. This is the horn on which he learned to play in 1913. The museum displays these original drawings of jazz greats by Richard E. Frenier, showing Pee Wee Russell, Sidney Bechet, J.C. Higginbottom, and Louis Armstrong. Sharky, like many older Americans, works in some months of the year and does not work in others. He gets Social Security benefits for the months he is not working, and if his earnings in a year are low, he may even get benefits for some of the months he did work. In addition to Social Security retirement benefits, he has the added protection of Medicare. Sharky, like millions of other Americans, 65 and over, feels a little more secure with the knowledge that in the event of illness or accident, Medicare hospital insurance pays all his covered hospital expenses for 60 days, except for the first $40. And if it is necessary for him to stay in the hospital over 60 days, all but $10 a day for another 30 days. When Medicare began, Sharky also signed up for the medical insurance part, which helps to pay doctor bills and other medical services. Medicare health insurance protection is available for almost everyone who is 65 or older. The jazz greats like Sharky spread the influence of New Orleans jazz throughout the world. Looking back over the years, Sharky remembers when he was just 14 and bought his first horn for $2.50. A few years later, in 1918, he was playing at the Milenburg Dance Hall. He recalls playing on the riverboat Island Queen as it cruised up and down the Mississippi River. He remembers leaving New Orleans for a year to play with Jimmy Durante's band at the College Inn in New York. When he returned to New Orleans, he opened his own dance hall, the Hollywood, featuring Sharkey and the Kings of Dixieland. Later, when playing at the famous Door on Bourbon Street, Sharkey's band featured Santo Pecora on trombone, Monk Hazel on drums, Chink Martin on bass, Sharkey on trumpet, Lester Reddick on piano, and Lester Bouchon on clarinet. Sharkey's musical career has spanned almost 5 decades, and his memory is a storehouse of the history of New Orleans jazz. New Orleans jazz has had a great influence on American music. At the turn of the century, it was played at picnics, minstrel shows, riverboat excursions, and even at funerals. Then, as more people heard more and more about jazz and liked what they heard, jazz became a household word. The 20s were called the Jazz Age. As jazz grew, it influenced the lives of the men who later became famous figures in jazz. Men like Buddy Bolden, King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton, and Louis Armstrong. It was George Gershwin who glamorized jazz with his Rhapsody in Blue. Paul Whiteman played Rhapsody in Blue in New York's Aeolian Hall. And at last, jazz became respectable. Jazz also enriched the language with words as expressive as the music. Words like hot, cool, and ragtime contributed to the dynamic growth of American English. Many of the old-time musicians who have become legendary figures in the world of jazz are now receiving Social Security benefits, as does Sharky Banano. Their lives, like the lives of all older Americans, are made a little easier with Social Security and the added protection of Medicare.
That's the story of Sharky Banano, a name that will live in the annals of jazz, America's own contribution to the world's music. Now, Sharky, in addition to his retirement benefits, now has the added protection of Medicare, as do other Americans 65 or over. But remember, anyone who waits until his 65th birthday to sign up will lose at least 1 month of his Medicare protection. The time to sign up is not after you're 65, but 2 or 3 months before you're 65. If one of your friends or relatives nearing 65, please urge him to visit, telephone, or write the Social Security office 2 or 3 months before his birthday, not after. You'll be doing him a favor, and we hope you'll favor Social Security in America by permitting us to visit with you next week.